He got away with it. This week, Senate Republicans voted to acquit President Donald Trump. But can he ever escape the taint of impeachment? I'll ask one of his closest allies. Steve Cortes, thanks for joining me on UpFront. On Wednesday, President Trump was acquitted on charges of abuse of power and obstruction of Congress. You must be delighted. The White House has called it a full exoneration for the president. But given this was the first full Senate impeachment trial in American history not to feature any witnesses, Senate Republicans did not allow any witnesses, it's not a full exoneration at all, is it?
Well, Mehdi, I think it is a partial exoneration. So I will partly agree with you, by the way. I'm one of the few people in sort of Team Trump who wanted witnesses, because I think that witnesses would have achieved that full exoneration. And so, again, I'm not saying that on behalf of the White House. I'm not even saying that on behalf of my organization, America First. That's just my personal opinion.
You're disagreeing with the White House that this is a full exoneration.
Was that I actually wanted, well, no, I'm just saying it is an exoneration, but for a full exoneration to prove to the American people, I think, just how corrupted this entire inquest was from the very beginning, I thought witnesses would have been helpful. There are still other ways that we can get to full exoneration. For example, Senate committees looking into the targeting of President Trump all the way back to his candidacy by the national security apparatus of the United States, continuing through his tenure as president-elect and then president of the United States. I still think that for full exoneration, we need that investigation to fully unfold.
Perhaps the most high-profile witness who Republicans in the Senate refused to call, but who was willing to come and testify, is President Trump's own former national security advisor, John Bolton, who says in a forthcoming book that the president told him he wanted to freeze aid to Ukraine until the Ukrainians launched investigations into his political opponents. If Trump isn't guilty, Steve, if there's nothing to hide, he did nothing wrong, he wouldn't have blocked Bolton, a Republican, from testifying, would he?
Well, look, he blocked lots of folks from the White House to testify, and for very good reasons, by the way. It's not because that's an indication of guilt. It's because executive privilege is a very fundamental premise of American law for the executive branch, and it's something that's important not just for President Trump to protect, but important for any president to have protection, that he can rely on taking advice in confidence from his advisors and knowing that it will stay in confidence. So that's a very important principle. It's an important precedent of American law. But look, again, had John Bolton been called as a witness, I'm fine with it, particularly in terms of the trade-off of I'd be happy to hear what John Bolton had to say under oath and juxtapose that, for example, with the whistleblower under oath, with the Bidens under oath, with Adam Schiff under oath. So I think it's too bad to some degree that the American people didn't get that full flushing out of this entire story, but so be it. You know, the Senate decided as is their prerogative.
They're going to get John Bolton's book very soon, so let's see what happens then.
Right.
On Wednesday, the vote to convict Trump on abuse of power was bipartisan. 47 Democrats plus 1 Republican, your party's former presidential candidate Mitt Romney, whereas the vote to acquit him was partisan. Only Republicans voted to acquit. And even among those Republicans, Steve, you had multiple senators, Lamar Alexander, Lisa Murkowski, Rob Portman, Susan Collins, who openly said there was nothing perfect about that call with the Ukrainian president, that it was wrong, that it was inappropriate. So again, this is not an exoneration for Trump, is it? He's still tainted.
No, I do not believe that he's tainted. Look, when it comes to some of the Republicans in the Senate, despite what the Democrats wanted to tell us, that he supposedly controls Republicans on the Hill with an iron grip, I think we've seen it actually exactly the opposite, particularly when it comes to the Senate. There is a lot of opposition to this president and to his agenda among Republicans in the United States Senate. If there weren't, for example, when we controlled both houses of Congress, we would have gotten the wall fully built on the southern border. So the idea that Adam Schiff and a lot of his allies in media continually put forward that he's some sort of king and he has almost dictatorial control over Republicans, it's just wrong, I believe, on the facts.
But on the issue of impeachment, multiple Republican senators criticized this president. I just want to play a clip of Donald Trump on the White House lawn in October, openly asking not just Ukraine, but China to investigate the Bidens. Have a listen.
And by the way, likewise, China should start an investigation into the Bidens, because what happened in China is just about as bad as what happened with Ukraine.
Put aside, Steve, for a moment the fact that a lot of Americans, including Republicans, think it's wrong for a US president to ask a foreign totalitarian government to investigate a US citizen. Let me ask you this. Why is it okay to ask China for a corruption investigation into Hunter Biden, son of Joe and a private citizen, but not for a corruption investigation into Ivanka Trump, daughter of Donald and White House advisor? In 2018, the Chinese government gave 5 trademarks to Ivanka's businesses at around the same time as her father, the president, rather conveniently, was trying to save a Chinese telecoms company from going bust.
Right. Okay. Well, listen, I think those are apples and oranges comparisons. If you want to, I can talk certainly about the Ivanka issue. First, Ivanka is a established and extremely successful businesswoman prior to her father entering politics. So it's not surprising that she would be able to gain trademarks in a country like China. There's nothing unusual about that.
It is unusual when you're working in the White House and your father is doing deals that favor the Chinese 6 days after you get those trademarks.
Well, look, the president has hardly been easy on China. If there's one thing that has really marked his presidency, it has been standing up to China regarding trade in particular.
At that point, he was randomly saying, I'm going to save this Chinese company. People were shocked at the time, and she did get a bunch of trademarks. I'm not saying she did anything corrupt. All I'm saying is, why haven't we heard people calling for an investigation into her for consistency?
But here's the thing. Because as far as I know, there's no credible allegation that anything was untoward there.
Whereas we look at Hunter Biden, allegations, more than with Hunter Biden. Most of the Hunter Biden allegations have been questioned heavily by experts.
Mehdi, look, when we look at Hunter Biden and what he did in China, and by the way, I think the corruption issue of the Bidens in China is a far greater issue, actually, than the Ukraine issue. I think it makes the Ukraine issue, while it's serious,
enough, but many would say the corruption issue of the Trump children who are in office right now is way worse than somebody who did something like 4 years ago and is no longer in government.
I would be the first to say that if the Trump children suddenly got massive business deals from a foreign government and a very corrupt government like the Chinese Communist Party, if they suddenly got massive business deals and huge pay packages in an area of business in which they have no previous expertise, in which they have never practiced before, such as Hunter Biden getting $1.5 billion from the government-controlled Bank of China for private equity, again, a business for which he had no track record, for which he had no credentials other than his last name and being his father's son. If that were to happen with the Trump children, then I would be the first to say
many would argue that's happening with the Trump children every day. But let me ask you this, Steve. You talk about corruption. Can you point me to a single specific case in Ukraine, or for that matter, anywhere else in the world, where President Trump has shown an interest in corruption or fighting corruption that does not involve Joe Biden or the Democrats? Just one example.
Yes. Well, for instance, we're talking a lot about China here. Look, the approach toward China right now that President Trump thankfully has commenced with in this country is that we're taking on China in a broad way, in a national security sense, in a trade way, and in a corruption sense. For example, America has been incredibly abused by the Chinese Communist Party regarding our intellectual property. That's corruption absolutely defined.
No, come on, Steve, that's not the same thing. I'm asking about specific cases of corruptions involving Ukrainian oligarchs or the Israeli prime minister who's indicted on charges of corruption, but is a good friend of the president. He doesn't show interest in any specific cases of corruption that don't involve Democrats.
Sure.
You know that.
No, I don't know that, but I can address. Here's the difference between Netanyahu and Biden, and there's a crucial difference. Netanyahu's not an American. He's not an American politician. He's a friend and ally, to be sure, of our country and of the president's on a personal level. But Joe Biden was a constitutional officer of the United States, the second highest constitutional officer of the United States. If he was engaged in corrupt practices, or if his family was, while he was the sitting vice president, that is an extremely relevant and appropriate angle for this country to pursue.
Well, I want to talk about the issue of immigration and race, huge issues in this country. You call yourself a nationalist. The president calls himself a nationalist. You've also been a member of the president's Hispanic Advisory Council. You're Hispanic yourself. And yet this is a president who opened his campaign by referring to Mexican immigrants as rapists, who has repeatedly referred to an invasion and invaders at the southern border, the same language, as you know, that's been used by white nationalist terrorists who have attacked synagogues, mosques, Latinos in grocery stores. You yourself, Steve, urged the president to tone down his, quote, inflammatory rhetoric on invasions, didn't you?
I did. I don't like the term invader. But two separate issues there, by the way. In terms of his opening, when he came down the escalator at Trump Tower and he talked about rapists and murderers coming from Mexico, all right, that is factually correct. Now, it's not the preponderance, of course. It's not even a large minority of the illegal migrants who come to this country. But it is a reality that there are people who come here illegally with ill intent.
That's not what he said, with respect.
And some of them wreak havoc upon this country. And by the way, they primarily wreak havoc upon Hispanic Americans. Our community community suffers the most the ravages of dangerous illegal aliens who are often allowed to stay in this country to hide in plain sight in so-called sanctuary cities. For example, MS-13, if you read the stories about the savagery of that gang,
you made
the
the point
victims
about
are
the
almost
rapists.
all Hispanic.
People heard what Trump said. We can all make up our own minds. On invaders, you've criticized them.
But I agree with you. I don't like the word invader.
So why does he say it so much?
Well, because he's the president. I'm not. Look,
That's
I don't
not
like
a
the word
reason for
invader.
why you say racist, offensive, insightful things. Just being the president.
No, I don't believe it's
doesn't give you a
racist. Okay, now this is important, and I will certainly defend him on this. Saying invader is not racist. There is nothing racist about defending our border for a couple of reasons. Number one, America's not a race, right? This is a multiracial country. Citizenship here has nothing to do with race. You are either born here or you're naturalized legally in a race-blind process.
But calling
so
brown
citizenship
people
in the
who cross the border into America invaders, yes, many would argue that is bigoted,
he would
racist.
He would call anyone.
Well, he didn't
he
call
would call
people
anyone
from
of any
Poland
color
or Norway invaders. He was referring to the southern border when he said it. In fact, Steve, he's run more than 2,000 Facebook ads referring to an invasion at the southern border, despite your advice and your protestations. When you have the Walmart shooter in El Paso, the mosque shooter in Christchurch, the synagogue shooter in Pittsburgh, all referring to foreign invaders, you can understand why so many people think this president is inciting violence and harming minorities. You can understand that, surely, when you look at the common language.
No, I certainly cannot. This president, as a matter of fact, and we saw it certainly in his State of the Union, which was very much really an appeal to minority Americans. You know, I actually put an article up about this. It was the State of the Union for minorities in terms of both the topics selected and the guests who were present for that magnificent State of the Union speech. It was really all about, number one, the accomplishments thus far that directly benefit minority Americans, and then number two, the road ahead and how minorities in this country, black and brown people who he deeply loves and cares about, are starting finally to fully participate in the economic.
I appreciate that's your argument,
America.
but deal with my question. When you have terrorists who are using the same language, offensive language that you and I don't like, about Jews and about Mexicans and about people in El Paso Walmarts, that's a problem, isn't it? You don't think it's a problem that the president says these invaders are coming here and then people go and shoot them and say these invaders are coming here? You don't think that's a problem?
There are sick, demented people who unfortunately want to use violence to achieve political ends. For example, the Scalise shooter on the left. Now, I would never blame that on Bernie Sanders, even though he clearly was an ardent Bernie Sanders supporter.
Bernie Sanders, Bernie Sanders condemned that shooter and didn't use any of the language that the shooter used against Republicans. Trump is saying
Are you saying
invasion.
that Donald Trump hasn't condemned these shooters? He's completely condemned these shooters. He's completely condemned all acts of violence against innocent Americans.
Let me read something to you. At a Trump rally in May, the president asked how he should stop migrants from illegally crossing the border. Someone in the crowd yelled out, "Shoot them." Trump did not condemn that remark, Steve. He smirked and he made a joke about it. Less than 3 months later, a man did shoot Latinos in an El Paso Walmart.
Look, he did not in any way
think it's okay to joke about shooting migrants? You think that's funny?
No.
I don't. I'm a migrant. I don't find that funny at all.
I don't think it's funny. You know what else I don't think is funny, though, is having a porous border because it's bad for our national and economic security in this
Steve,
country.
that's another debate for another day. I'm asking about shooting people and making jokes about shooting people and calling them invaders. That's a problem. Surely you and I can agree on that.
I don't like, as I've told you now, I think 3 times. I don't prefer the term invader. I don't. Okay. However, that doesn't mean in any sense that I'm soft on this issue. Illegal immigration is a scourge upon this country, and it is a scourge that primarily, mostly, disproportionately ravages minority American citizens. This president is doing his best. Unfortunately, he's been obstructed by the courts and by Congress, but he is doing his best to, at long last, gain sovereignty over our country. It's one of the primary reasons that he was elected. It is an animating principle of our movement, and he has followed through, unlike so many other conservative people like Mitt Romney, for example, who give us lip service.
He has certainly followed through on this issue. You say Trump isn't a racist. I just want to play a clip from a Trump rally in New Mexico a few months ago, which you were at, and where the president said this jokingly about you.
He happens to be Hispanic, but I've never quite figured it out because he looks more like a wasp than I do. What do you like more, the country or the Hispanics? He says the country. I don't know. I may have to go for the Hispanics, to be honest with you.
Steve, he questioned your identity as a Hispanic American, he questioned your loyalty to America, and he questioned your skin color. How is that not racist?
No, look, first of all, he didn't question my Hispanicness. He's joking, right? It was a moment of levity, and he's having some fun at my expense because he teases me.
He looks more like a wasp than I do.
Because
That's okay.
Mehdi, he teases me he teases me often in private, and in this case he did in public, that I look like such a Wall Street banker. Okay, so he's making fun of
your
my clothes and my
loyalty
demeanor.
is to Hispanics, not to America?
Now, no. And look, there again, what he meant was clearly, and look, I know this because I know him and because I talk with him privately when there aren't cameras about this issue. What he meant there was, you love both so much. You love America so much. You love the Hispanic community so much. And then in an inartful way, he said, which do you like more? All right. It's just an offhand comment.
But he didn't just say, which do you like more? He then said, he says the country, I don't know. You don't think that feeds into tropes about disloyal foreigners? Even if it's a joke. And jokes can be racist, Steve. You know that.
No, look, he was clearly laughing. I was laughing. By the way, if somebody's going to be offended,
lots of people laugh at racist jokes, Steve. Steve, lots of people laugh at racist jokes. The fact that we laugh at something doesn't mean it's not racist.
No, Mehdi, I would never tolerate a racist comment, even from President Trump, whom I greatly admire. I would never tolerate a racist comment, particularly one directed at me. I will tell you this story about the president and I privately. The very first time I ever got in the Oval Office in February of 2017, when he welcomed me in, the very first thing he said, just the two of us, no one else there, was, what can I do to help Hispanic Americans in this country, Steve? And then we had a substantive conversation, primarily about small business and about deregulation. That is the heart of this president. That's the mind of this president. Okay. These are the results that have been achieved so far. So, again, he speaks inartfully. He speaks at times very inelegantly. I'll be the first to admit that as somebody who, for the last several years, has to come on shows like this and explain some of his statements. But he also speaks...
Well, on that note, as someone who comes on this show to explain statements, one last question before I let you go. On Sunday, the Kansas City Chiefs won the Super Bowl, and President Trump went on Twitter and congratulated the state of Kansas, even though the team is based in Kansas City, Missouri. When the president does or says things like this, which show his lack of knowledge of basic geography, American history, world events, how embarrassed do you feel? How hard does it make your job coming on having to defend him?
No. Look, I wasn't embarrassed at all. And here's the reason. There is a Kansas City, Kansas, first of all, next to Kansas City, Missouri. There are tons of Chiefs fans in the state of Kansas. So was it a mistake? Of course it was a mistake. Was it consequential? Not remotely in my mind. I really don't. To me, it's something you laugh about that he quickly corrected.
Steve Cortes, thanks so much for joining me on UpFront.
Thank you, Mehdi. Appreciate it.
Tens of thousands of people have become infected with the coronavirus, a respiratory illness that broke out in Wuhan, China, in December. So far, the rate of death is less than 3%. But as China scrambles to contain the viral epidemic, foreign nations are evacuating their citizens, and already the global economy is feeling the impact of cancelled flights and businesses closing. So, is the coronavirus destined to become the next pandemic? Many certainly seem to think so, and the fear is leading to open racism against China. Joining me to discuss the Chinese and global responses to the coronavirus is Wang Guan, an anchor for China Global Television Network, CGTN, and their former chief political correspondent. He's been covering the coronavirus from CGTN headquarters, and he joins me now from Beijing. Wang Guan, thank you for joining me on UpFront. You've been following this story and this virus, which has killed more than, I believe, 500 people in China so far, tragically. Tell us, what is the situation in China right now? What's it like on the ground?
Well, Mehdi, there has been a concerted national campaign against this outbreak, but I'm not going to lie, the situation is still grim. 3,000 people getting infected every single day in the past couple of days. And we're doing a few things here. First of all, tending those very sick. That's why experienced doctors are pulled from across the country to the ICUs in Wuhan. And secondly, tending those who are less symptomatic, but are no less contagious. Because these people, in the past, there was a lack of medical resources to tend to these people. But these people were out and about passing the virus to others. So that in the past few days, 2 hospitals were built in just 2 weeks, and 11 makeshift hospitals were built so that these people can be taken in, and hopefully we can cut their path of transmission.
And yet one health expert at the University of Hong Kong said this week, quote, there's no sign that it's getting better. Is he right? Does China have the capacity to deal with this crisis at speed?
I think we do have the capacity to deal with this epidemic. Well, right now, twice as many patients got recovered than those who died. And of course, if we look at the absolute numbers, there has been a rise in those infected patients, but that's partly because of better and quicker testing. Diagnosis has been reduced from 4 days to just 1. And also the pool, the basis for suspected patients have been increased, meaning you take in not just those people in the past, but also who are coughing, who are showing symptoms.
Okay. This week, the Politburo Standing Committee, made up of President Xi Jinping and China's top officials, admitted to, quote, shortcomings and deficiencies in the government's response to the outbreak. But it's more than just shortcomings and deficiencies, isn't it? When the outbreak began in Wuhan and 8 people sounded the alarm, they were intimidated by local police. They were accused of making false comments. They were told to stop the, quote, illegal activity. Now hundreds of people are dead. That's what happens when you censor public opinion, isn't it?
Well, Mehdi, here is what happened. Of course, there's no denying that there should have been more information, more transparency, and a better emergency response system in place in Wuhan in the first place. But it's also fair to say that Beijing was very quick to get on top of things. You have the Chinese president saying that transparency is key, timely publication of information is key. In fact, those 8 people, the 8 whistleblowers you mentioned, they were vindicated by none other than China's Supreme Court.
Okay. There's some who would argue that China's gone from one extreme to another. First, pretending there's nothing wrong and rounding up people who complained about the virus. And now rounding up anyone who has the virus or anyone who doesn't report it. You have the vice premier who's leading the government response saying this week, and I quote, during these wartime conditions, there must be no deserters or they will be nailed to the pillar of historical shame forever.
I think this quote is taken out of context. You've got to be brave. You've got to confront this virus. The situation is grim. There needs to be a concerted effort. You cannot run away from the front line. I think this is what the vice premier means.
We're also seeing reports that there are confirmed cases of the coronavirus in Xinjiang, the region in western China, where some 1 million Muslim Uyghur Chinese citizens are being held in what the government calls re-education camps. Should the coronavirus spread in that region or in those camps, does China have the infrastructure or the will to stop it from spreading there among the Uyghurs?
Mehdi, I appreciate your concern, but I think that is a highly hypothetical question because right now
it's not
Xinjiang
hypothetical.
Has
there is an outbreak in Xinjiang.
There is no outbreak in Xinjiang. There have been very few cases in Xinjiang. Actually, Xinjiang ranks number 6 from the bottom in terms of the confirmed cases. There has not been a single death in Xinjiang so far. The situation is well under control over there.
Well, we wouldn't know what's happening in the camps, obviously, because the media is not allowed in.
Some media are allowed in, obviously.
Before we run out of time, let's talk about the global reaction. There have been travel restrictions, cancelled flights, and evacuations by military aircraft. But so far, less than 1% of the deaths from this virus have happened outside of China. So do you believe the world is overreacting to this virus or not?
I think some people are definitely overreacting. Look, Mehdi, what we need right now are facts, not fear. 97% of the deaths occurred in Hubei, the epicenter, and 80% of the deaths are the seniors over 60 years of age with underlying diseases such as cardiovascular problems. So outside Hubei province, the death rate, the mortality rate is just 0.17%. To put that in perspective, according to CDC of the US, the flu death rate in the US is just 0.13%. So the coronavirus by and large is much less lethal than MERS, for example, that has a 34% death rate, or Ebola that has a 50% death rate. The coronavirus right now has an overall global death rate of 2%.
What would you say to people in the West who say the problem is we can't trust whether China is being fully honest and accurate about the extent of this virus and its spread?
Well, come to China and see for yourself. Up-to-the-minute updates on new infections, suspected cases, confirmed deaths are made available on virtually all media platforms. I just checked my phone right now. Actually, it is an issue of grave concern here in China, of great public concern. People are fighting this virus in solidarity. Those who don't trust China, they have a track record of not trusting China. It's their problem. Some are anti-China, some are xenophobic, some are afraid of China's rise.
On that note about being anti-China, there have been numerous reports of, people making some pretty bigoted anti-Chinese racist remarks in the wake of this outbreak. Signs in Japanese restaurants that say no Chinese. A French newspaper with the headline Yellow Alert. As a Chinese citizen and journalist, are you worried about the rise and escalation in anti-China racism as a result of this latest controversy?
I think those events are disturbing. You have a woman in New York City Metro being pushed and, called racial slurs. Those racial slurs are used against Chinese and Asians across Europe. Those are disturbing. But you know what's more disturbing? It's the Western media reports. For example, Der Spiegel, one of the most circulated magazines in Europe. They have a headline that read this: the virus, regarding the coronavirus, a little racism is fine. And quote, thanks to the yellow-skinned slit eyes, that we may all be dead soon. And you have the Wall Street Journal, of course, calling China the real sick man of Asia. These are really concerning issues because now some Westerners are calling the coronavirus the China virus. But I didn't remember people calling Zika the Brazil virus or Ebola the Congo virus. So people need not panic. People need facts. People should look at it in an objective manner. Yes, it originated from China. We have a lot of introspection to do as Chinese, but please show some respect because we, the Chinese people, are fighting this virus to the best of our abilities.
Wang Guan, thank you for joining me on UpFront.
Thank you, Magdi.
That's our show. UpFront will be back next week.